All right. Hi, everyone. Why don't we get started? So I'm Ian. Welcome to Brooklyn Public Philosophers. It's a monthly public philosophy speaker series entering the second half of its third year now. It brings philosophers from the greater Brooklyn area to discuss their work with the general audience. I'm really glad that Armen Marsoobian could join us today. He's going to be speaking about his work on memorializing the Armenian Genocide. I should perhaps note he's the author of the recently published Fragments of a Lost Homeland, Remembering Armenia, which the library doesn't happen to have in stock, but which is available. So, okay, well, please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you, everyone, for coming on this wintry month. I did manage to miss the snowstorm. We got some in Connecticut. When Ian said greater Brooklyn area, you know, I'm actually in Connecticut and actually northeast of New Haven. So I think greater Brooklyn has become even bigger. I'm going to be speaking and showing a lot of images. My work has changed over the last 6 or 7 years. I began this project about 6 or 7 years ago. I see myself as a public philosopher, and also I've become, in a way, an activist. I've been given up doing theoretical or abstract philosophy, but I'm applying some of the things I've been thinking about for quite a while to a project that is ongoing in the Republic of Turkey. It also has aspects outside of Turkey. So that's what I'm going to be presenting today. I will begin. I will read a little, then I will talk a little. I'll show some slides. This is sort of the outline of what I'm going to do. I'll first read a little about the genocide denial and collective memory, and the project that I'm engaged in of memorialization. And a component of that is what is called bearing witness to the victims of genocide. I'll talk about aspects of bearing witness. And then in the part 5, I will talk about the projects, or the project that I'm engaged in Turkey and in other places. A quick question. How many know anything about the Armenian Genocide? Okay, there are a number of you do. Because I know for many decades it was considered the forgotten genocide. But as some of you are aware, there's been much more attention paid to it in the last 20 years, and it culminated in 2015. This past year was the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the Armenian Genocide, which is symbolically identified with April 24th, 1915. On that date in Constantinople, today's Istanbul, 200 to 300 intellectuals, political leaders, artists, even philosophers were rounded up, arrested, and deported. Many of them did not survive. But the genocide did not end in 1915 or in 16. In many ways, it continued up until the founding of the Turkish Republic in 1923. But I won't give you history. I want to talk about the project that I'm working on and about genocide denial. Now, an integral component of modern genocides is the systematic destruction of cultural artifacts of the targeted population. Whether it's the destruction of synagogues during the Holocaust in Europe, or mosques in Bosnia during the Bosnian genocide, or churches in historic Armenian lands of modern Turkey, the perpetrators, or the heirs of the perpetrators, attempt to minimize their crimes by wiping the landscape clean of any reminders of their victims. Great time and effort go into engineering a collective amnesia that contributes to the national narrative that is used to justify and glorify the actions of the perpetrators. In the case of the Armenian genocide, much attention has been paid in recent years to efforts to have the genocide recognized and its denial criminalized by nation states. I know every spring in the United States there's an effort in Congress to have a proclamation that recognizes the Armenian genocide. It's never succeeded in getting past the political hurdles and the pressure from the Republic of Turkey. The same every April 24th, President of the United States gives a proclamation recognizing what happened but not using the word genocide, even though Obama during the last presidential campaign said he would use the word, but he hasn't used the word. Now, such efforts of genocide recognition have had little or no positive impact on the status quo in Turkey. And on the contrary, some would argue that it's had a negative effect, in a sense that it's hardened the nationalist rhetoric of denial, and it's possibly made life more difficult for the small number of Armenians still living in Turkey. And a lot of people don't realize, but there are anywhere from 60 to 70,000 Armenians living in Turkey today, mostly in Istanbul and some of the other major cities. But besides that, there are, some estimate, a couple of 100,000 hidden Armenians. Armenians who took Turkish identities, and their children and grandchildren have Armenian ancestors but have been forced to live as Turks. This debate about genocide recognition I won't take up today. What I want to take up is an alternative approaches that attempt to chip away at what I call this collective amnesia in Turkey. Alternative approaches to combating genocide denial in its many forms are underway by the joint efforts of Armenians and Turks within Turkey and in the international cultural arena. Organizations like the Hrant Dink Foundation, the Center for Truth, Justice, and Memory, the History Foundation, are all working on various projects to deal with this issue of collective amnesia. In this talk, I describe one such effort, one I'm involved in with, that I've begun about 4 or 5 years ago with an organization called Anadolu Kültür, Anatolian Culture. It's a Turkish NGO. And the gallery space, Depot, which is a converted tobacco factory warehouse in Istanbul, it's an art center gallery. They consider it also a critical debate space for cultural exchange. Now, we've organized a photography exhibition, and I'll show you a number of photos of the exhibition and some of the photos that tells the story of one extended Armenian family, the Dildilians, in the Ottoman Empire from about the 1870s until November, December 1922, when they were forced to leave. Now, members of this family, and this family is my family, members of this family, 6 members of this family over the course of the last 90 years were professional photographers. And maybe I can show you one of my answers. My great-grandfather, he wasn't a photographer, but this was one of the early photographs that my grandfather took of his father, probably in around 1892. And this is a photo of my grandfather, the photographer who started the family business of photography, continued to do so in Greece, and passed away in 1935. And this is my mother, who also was a professional photographer in Greece, though not in Turkey. And she gave up photography when she came to the United States. And I couldn't help myself, but I had to include a photo of me, who's not a photographer, in this. I always wanted to do this in a philosophy talk. And that's my grandmother and my brother. None of those people were photographers. Now, members of my family, as I said, were photographers, and they documented their lives and their community, not just in photographs, but in extensive memoirs. I'm very fortunate in the sense that, unlike many Armenian families whose surviving grandparents or great-grandparents were forced in the deportation marches and were fortunate enough to survive, but without anything, maybe a photo or two, but we managed, and I won't get into the details of it, to come out of this Holocaust in the time of the First World War with hundreds and hundreds of photographs and negatives and memoirs that members of the family wrote that tell the story of their lives. And what I've been doing is taking this material and the writings and the images as a means of memorializing and bearing witness to the suffering that they underwent and many Armenians underwent during the genocide. In a sense, they began the process of bearing witness, and I'll say some things about the concept of bearing witness by attempting to save these images and to write down their experiences, first for the generations that followed in the family, but then also wanting to share that story not just with members of the family, but with the public in general. Now, I mean, for the most part, these images do not represent directly the suffering, because they're not images of bodies. They're not the sort of Holocaust films that we have of the survivors of the death camps, but they're images of what was lost, so the life that these people had experienced. This is a panoramic photograph of the hometown of Marsoobian in Turkey, where my mother was born, where my grandfather ran his photo studio. Many of these buildings are in the Armenian part of town. Those are very important high schools, girls' schools. I've identified the homes of my great aunts here. And as you see, these white buildings are all part of a missionary college called Anatolia College. It's a very advanced educational center. And there is the family home with the glass roof for the photography studio, because they use natural northern light. So there are many images like these of landscapes. They're not just professional portrait photography. They did landscape photography. They took photographs of harbors and historic monuments. And these were the schools, the Armenian schools in the community. As I said, here's an image of the family home with the glass roof. These are the hospital and various schools, part of the college. After the war, they worked for Near East Relief. I don't know if you've heard of Near East Relief. It was one of the major humanitarian efforts from the United States to deal with the crisis of the orphans and the disease at the end of the First World War. Members of the family also operated the orphanages, and this is just an example of the boy orphans in Marsoobian at the end of the war in probably 1919. And also as a professional photographer, they took photographs of government officials. This is after the war, 1920, and there's my grandfather with his assistants taking photographs of the nationalist leaders that Kemal Ataturk, at the time Mustafa Kemal, organized for the War of Independence. And these people that my grandfather is photographing in this image eventually was the cause of my family being forced to leave 2 years after this image was taken. This is the photograph that he took. So there's obviously someone taking a photograph of him taking a photograph. So they're very conscious of documenting their own work. This is the first foreign minister of Turkey. And this is one of the last images. This is on the boat when they're forced to leave in November 1922. This image has many of the orphans because they were running the orphanage, and there is my grandmother on the ladder of the SS Belgravia leaving Samsun Harbor in November 1922. And of course, again, documenting what's happening to them in real time. It's an amazing photograph. This is just part of the photograph. But you can imagine my grandfather telling my grandmother, get up on that ladder, point to the life preserver so we can, document our exile. So, that's just a little sample of the work. What I want to do now is to, as I say, talk about really the theme, the memorialization and bearing witness in the aftermath of the Armenian Genocide. Now, the concept of bearing witness was central to my family's efforts a century ago and to my efforts today. When one bears witness, one addresses an audience, sometimes multiple audiences. My family's efforts to bear witness were primarily directed to their descendants, as I said, or to the Armenian diaspora in general, and in some cases, to the Western powers that failed to help the Armenians. And you can sort of hear certain echoes of what's going on today in the Middle East, and the fact that, we have this crisis in Europe with refugees. We have quite a bit of violence going on all across the Middle East, and the West trying to figure out what to do about it, especially now when the problem is falling in our laps in Europe and in the United States. But my project has an important new audience, and those are the citizens of the current Republic of Turkey. And in the second part of my talk, I will describe some of in more specific detail, the aspects of my work on the ground in Turkey today. First, I want to lay out a bit of the theoretical background. I guess this is the philosophy part. My thesis or objective. I began to think about this in part as a result of some work I did on democracy. I'm a philosopher who's sort of brought up in the American classical tradition of pragmatism. I've done work on the American pragmatists, Peirce, James, in particular Dewey. Dewey's writings about democracy. Democracy is a way of life, not necessarily a political structure. And part of what I'm trying to do in a sense, and this is, of course, very ambitious, and I'm not going to get very far with it in my lifetime, but the hope is to plant certain kinds of seeds for the conditions of improving the democracy in the Republic of Turkey. And as I said, I've come to understand that a healthy democracy has to have a critical perspective on its own history. And that's true whether you're in a country like Turkey or in a country like the United States. And we've come a long way, and we have a lot further to go with regard to how we see our own history, in particular our Native American genocide. So collective memory then becomes a focus of my work. So let me briefly define what I mean by collective memory. First, let me say that collective memory does not imply sort of a belief in the reality of a group mind or some mental entity that exists independently of individual human beings, though there are some religious positions that make that claim. Neither is collective memory merely the aggregation of individual personal memories. While it is impossible to have personal memories devoid of social or situational context, this does not account for the truly collective nature of the memory I speak of. Collective memory, in this aggregate sense, fails to capture the socially constituted nature of collective memory. In contrast to this aggregated view of memory, collective memory is a form of what I like to call remembering together. Remembering together is a common activity of groups and is self-constituting and reconstituting. Whether it's the shared memories of family members at a family reunion. For instance, our family has a reunion every year, and we're often telling stories, and sometimes you can't remember if you were actually, you think you were actually there when the incident happened, but you realize maybe you weren't there, and it all sort of becomes a memory of the collectivity. So you're, in a sense, remembering together. Or another example are activities such as when Armenians gather every April 24th for the Armenian Genocide. These conjoint activities both reflect and construct a collective memory. And that's how memory is passed on through generations. Now, the philosopher Jeffrey Bluestein writes, members of a community jointly recall and jointly reconstruct the past, and through these joint activities bind themselves together in particular ways. Bluestein nicely captures this phenomenon of collective memory with the phrase, community of memory. This phenomenon is especially evident in those instances when such memories have broad reach and long endurance. Such a community of memory does not require personal first-hand experience of an event that is collectively recalled. Often through symbolic, artistic, or literary reenactments of reenactments of the trauma of others, one may have a personally emotional response that is significantly different from the response one might feel in recollecting. It might be significantly, not significantly different than remembering a trauma that you remember. So in a sense, you can experience the trauma of others personally through collective memory. One may cry, as I did, in front of the names etched on the polished granite, black granite wall of the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., even though one did not know the individuals there memorialized. The collective memory of the war deeply marked a generation, certainly my generation of Americans, despite the lack of a consensus as to the war's meaning. Collective memory can also be passed down through many generations, with each generation creating a new context and content for what will be jointly recalled by subsequent generations. I believe I've sort of talked about what these two statements are claiming, and I'm talking here in the second paragraph about what motivates me to do this memory work in Turkey about collective memory. Now, as I said, I'm a philosopher who began my studies looking at the classic American philosophers, in particular John Dewey. I soon realized back in my graduate student days that John Dewey actually traveled to Turkey for a short period of time in the summer of 1924, soon after the founding of the Turkish Republic. He was asked by Mustafa Kemal, then the president of Turkey, to advise their education ministry on how to rebuild the Turkish educational system, or build, because there wasn't really one there in the first place, knowing Dewey's work in educational reform in the United States. That's another story that I've written and published about, but it motivated me to sort of think about the role of education that's played, the role education plays in collective memory. And it was clear to my disappointment when I read what Dewey wrote, even though his recommendations were generally positive, he bought into the Turkish mythic narrative, the story of the genocide, but from the Turkish perspective, the national narrative. It was a very disappointing moment in my studies, and I put Dewey aside for that aspect of Dewey aside and got my dissertation done. It wasn't until many years later I revisited that issue in a critical way. But in recent years, I've thought about this idea of a national narrative, and we have a national narrative too, but we've now come to approach it quite critically. You know, it's not that sort of thing you learned about the Pilgrims and you know, the nice meal they had and all that. We know a lot about the diseases that were brought over and the massacres of Native Americans, and also the massacres of the settlers. So, and then of course we know the complexities of our Civil War and and the aftermath of that. I began then to think about how important this idea of a myth, or of what some scholars call a foundational myth. And in certain societies, that foundational myth has a stronger hold, and part of it is a result of how it's inculcated in students, and that's certainly the case in Turkey. Now, the one notion of this, and I'll skip here. We've talked about this already. I want to go back to this. This is the foundational myth. I'm quoting him from Jeffrey Bluestein, who's done some, I think, exceptional work on the question of memory. Here he talks about this notion of a foundational myth. He's elaborated on the social function of these types of myths. And these are the types of myths that get a hold on a society and result in, as we saw in the Holocaust, some horrendous consequences. Bluestein writes, myths of this sort, these foundational myths, provide symbolic resources for underwriting present identity constituting values, institutions, and ideals. So in a sense, they're central to one's own self-identity. They connect a group to its own past and help to distinguish it from other groups in the eyes of the group members. So these myths also contribute to group identity. And they embody norms that serve as organizing principles of social life, norms that are capable of generating not only intellectual assent, but emotional commitment. And this is the danger of these kinds of myths. These features are all essentially independent of the historical truth of what the myth relates, and they explain both the value and the peril of collective memory. So self-identity, group identity, social norms are all buttressed by these foundational myths. In short, we are who we are, what we believe, and what we aspire to, all are strongly influenced by our community's foundational myths. None of these features are necessarily connected with what, in the social science sense, we call critical history. Such history is governed by a methodology whose focus is not upon these foundational myths, are not governed by a methodology whose focus is upon establishing the truth about past events. And this is where the problem with the collective memory in Turkey lies, because of the centralized educational system. I've met many Turks in the United States and in Turkey who only heard about the Armenian Genocide after leaving Turkey. Now that's changing today because of the internet, but also we also have in Turkey quite a bit of censorship coming back into place with regard to social media and the internet, and that's unfortunate. So this centralized system controls the curriculum, the textbooks, and it makes it hard to penetrate the thinking of the youth of Turkey until at some point when they're out of the educational system. And the other thing that stood out when I was reading John Dewey's remarks about education in relation to Turkey, he also warned against, he saw a value in using individuals to get students interested in history. So we do that in the United States. You know, we have our heroes in our stories as a tool to get people interested. But he warned against the dangers of what he called hagiographic biographies of these individuals, and we have that in Turkey today with Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal, where his picture is everywhere, where he's become sacred, and it's dangerous to say anything about him in a negative sense. Unfortunately, that's now been transferred to the current president of Turkey, Erdogan, who will often prosecute you if you say anything negative about the president. It's an interesting democracy we live in. And part of this sort of making sacred these individuals, again, it blunts the kind of critical examination, critical thinking, critical history that's important to start the process of thinking about our collective memory. So denigrating Ataturk, Turkishness, the institutions of the state have all been criminalized in one form or another over the last 50 years. The Nobel Prize winner Orhan Pamuk stands out as one of the many individuals so prosecuted under these laws. And most tragically, the crusading Turkish Armenian newspaper editor and journalist Hrant Dink was also prosecuted under the same law and then was killed, assassinated by a nationalist in 2007. So let me conclude this examination of collective memory by highlighting two important ways in which it is transmitted from one generation to another. These are important for the practices that I'll describe in my work that I'll show you shortly. One practice is memory activities. And memory activity could be as simple as gathering together to have a memorial, as we do on September 11th here in the United States and in New York. And memory places, places that are about the past. Traditional practices, whether of a religious or secular kind, embody collective memory. Public commemorative ceremonies, pilgrimages, historical reenactments are all forms of memory activities. These activities are often tied to memory places. Archives, museums, libraries such as this library are places of memory and serve the explicit function of collecting and preserving memory. Though often they can be used to manipulate and distort memory, as has been the case with the Turkish government's cleansing of certain Ottoman archives in regard to the Armenian Genocide. Some memory places, such as historical monuments and plaques, are intentionally created in order to keep us from forgetting important community events. Architectural edifices, such as public buildings, historical homes, places of worship, and cemeteries are places of memory. Even street names, neighborhood names, and the names of towns and cities all can have a memorial function. So my work, what I call my memory work, and the art it employs, and I refer to the art of photography, are the means by which my partners and I are attempting to change this collective memory in Turkey by bearing witness to a history that's been denied and suppressed. Memorials and memorial art can serve many functions. As I said, they can address a small audience or family members or a wider public audience. And not all forms of memorialization are a form of bearing witness, because we don't necessarily memorialize. Bearing witness has to do with bearing witness to the suffering of others. We can memorialize people or events that didn't have great suffering. But crucial to the concept of bearing witness, besides this sort of remembrance, memorialization aspect, is the idea of testimony. Witnesses, and let's see if I have something. Yes, I'm talking about bearing witness here. Yes, the testimonial function of bearing witness. Witnesses are supposed to seek to uncover or relate the truth about what happened or is still happening. This is especially important in the case of the Armenian Genocide because of the continuing denial that's taken place over 100 years. And the denial, as someone who's studied many genocides and teaches genocide studies courses, we all know that the denial begins during the genocide, begins even before the actual killing takes place. It's an integral part of almost any genocide that you can think of. We have in the Holocaust the elaborate attempt by the Germans in Theresienstadt to demonstrate to the Red Cross that this was a community of Jews that have been now set aside in their own town and they will flourish. Those who bear witness have a moral responsibility to find out the truth and to tell it, warts and all, including myself. The imperative to speak the truth in the context of bearing witness adds a greater burden on those who engage in memory work in hostile or indifferent societies. Memorial art can and often is propagandistic, and this is something to avoid. And this is when I say that testimony is important. Testimony has to be carefully presented, and warts and all. So the question in the Armenian Genocide is you have incidents and massacres that Armenians engaged in against Turks at certain points in that period, 1915 to 1922. So one shouldn't engage in the same sort of process of denial for the wrongs that were done in your ethnic group's name. Though, of course, when you study the history, the context and the severity of what happened on either side is no very comparable. Now, while some acts of bearing witness address a relatively, as I said, small audience, others, such as Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, is a form of bearing witness. And they have a large public audience and take a wider historical significance. In the case of the Holocaust, we have what's going on in the Shoah Foundation at UCLA, at USC, where there is a digitalization of testimonies of the survivors of the camps of the Holocaust. And this will forever preserve the witnessing of the survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. As I suggested at the beginning of my talk, the primary goal of the memory project I'm engaged in is to begin a process of gradual change in the collective memory of the Turkish people, a change that is required for building a democratic way of life. And it's important to know your audience when you're doing this. So as I'll show with some of the exhibitions I've had to change things as I go along, depending on what part of even Turkey I'm showing these images. And I'd like to sort of conclude this sort of more theoretical part of my talk by saying one last thing about bearing witness. Bearing witness also has a psychological effect for those people who do bear witness. Not just for the descendants or the survivors of these things, the Holocaust, but also there's a reparative part of the process, a psychological reparative part of the process. And I think that's important for survivors and the descendants of any kind of large-scale human catastrophe. And in also bearing witness, one is attempting to rebalance the moral order by giving those individuals whose voice has been denied and destroyed the respect and dignity that they deserved. In a sense, it's a way of, in part, restoring the moral universe that was destroyed by the genocide. And enough of my talking more theoretically. Let me show you some of the things that I've done in putting these ideas in place in Turkey. There are three parts to my memory project. One is the photography exhibition, the books or the publications, and the sites of memory. The first event that we engaged in was an exhibition in Istanbul at this space called Depot. This is, as I said, a gallery, a place of critical and cultural dialogue. This is just a copy of the booklet that we prepared, or the poster. These are just two examples of it here. One is in English, one is in Turkish, and we were giving these out free over the course of a couple of months of the exhibition. And this is just, I don't know if you can see it. People in the back, can you see this? You know, if we want to turn the lights a little down, is that possible? Is that better? Okay. These are large-scale reproductions of the photographs, and this is an example of our setting up the exhibition in 2 floors of this exhibition space. And we had panels that were 5-6 feet high. These are attached to the walls. All the text, as you see, there's a lot of text, and it's Turkish. For those who didn't speak Turkish, who happened to be in Istanbul, we had the English booklet that you could follow. So it was combining the narrative, which I took from hundreds and hundreds of pages of memoirs, and it was then, I summarized this family story, and then was translated into Turkish on these panels. That's just a photograph of all the members of the family that survived after the genocide in 1922. I forget exactly the number there, but 50, 60 members of the family did not survive. And we had a chronological narrative. We also had thematic parts of the exhibition. This deals with the aftermath of the genocide with all the orphans and the orphan work. This is just an example of what one of the panels looked like. This happens to tell the story of my grandfather marrying my grandmother and building their house in Turkey. So it's a very personal, you could get involved in the family narrative. It wasn't a narrative about genocide, it was a narrative about an extended family over a few decades in Turkey. And we had examples of the kind of photographic work, portrait work they did. Turkish gentleman with his dog. Some of these are unknown people, some of them are college professors, some of them are my relatives. We also had on the second floor a lot of contextual material. If people want to learn more about Armenians, they could by looking at these panels. Let me just go back. Initially, we were concerned about security, so we weren't going to use any original images. Last minute, we included one of this sort of glass display with some or very few original photographs. The family was also in the business of taking photographs that were made into postcards. And there was a big part of the photography business with these postcards. And these are just examples of some of the postcards that were taken. And then I also displayed under a glass light some of the glass negatives. Because surprisingly, I have about a couple hundred glass negatives that made it from central Anatolia through the Black Sea to the Aegean Sea, across Europe to the United States, to New York, to Hartford, to New Haven, sitting in my house in Connecticut. These are just examples of one of my uncles who was also interested in photography. He went on to become an engineer and a trustee of the college in that town. The other significant component of the exhibition were oral testimonies.
My name is Ara Dildilian.
We created this video
I live in
of
Fonda,
interview in
Old Trail,
1968 that I discovered.
New York. I was born in Marsoobian. Marsoobian is located probably about 50 miles south from Samsun on the Black Sea. It was a college town, and Anatolia College was very close to our house. In fact, our house was a part of the campus. Marsoobian was
in the video. There are Turkish subtitles.
city.
They're not. You don't see it
And a very large Armenian colony, not a colony, but settlement. The old part of the city, the citadel, was the Armenian church, and Armenian sections all around it. There was a very small Greek population there. It was a new settlement. Of course, Greeks were living in that neighborhood also for centuries, because that's considered a part of Pontus. It was quite an intellectual community. Armenians had very good schools. Then the Anatolia College was established there, which became a source of inspiration probably, or enlightenment. And there was the American hospital there, very massive stone building. The oxen-driven wagons would come, and
He's talking about
people
the
were
deportation.
allowed to take just a few of their belongings, and you'd see them go, and endless. They'd go, and up the hill, our house was on a hill, they had to go that way, and its surprising thing was that the rule was that the same drivers would be back with the cart within a day or so, and to take another load, and they knew that the people were not being driven very far, and that they just to a certain point. Beyond that, they were either being massacred or the women and the girls taken away from them, and the others just walked until they dropped dead. In fact, I remember one neighbor to the south of us, downhill. The whole family were over there, and they had a baby boy. And I was asked to take care of the baby boy, and of course they were waiting for the ox wagons to come and to pick them up. And then the word came that they were there. And just as they were leaving, I remember that woman. Keep him.
I didn't get that clearly.
She said, keep the baby, and we kept the baby. And that baby stayed with us until the war was over. We found his grandmother. Grandmother stayed with us later on. And he's in Greece now.
Okay. That video was quite a moving experience for a lot of people during the exhibition, and it wasn't uncommon to see people very shaken listening to that account of the deportations. But of course, we didn't just focus on the deportation in the videos. I have a video interview with my mother that I included in the exhibition in 1989.
Yeah, because it was the only photographer that section. That's why the Turks didn't kill him. They just took him as a soldier, and they used to. That's why our family didn't go to Akso.
They weren't deported.
No. And whoever was there, all my relatives, some of my aunts and so on, uncles, he kept them. He could keep all the relatives they lived in Marfa, whoever was. But the others that were in Samson or Sapatia or Harper, they all were deported and were killed, most of them, nearly all of them. His wedding, and we were all, as I told you, from the studios, they went up, and there was a balcony hall. The young children were sitting all at that balcony and looking down in the big hall to see the wedding. That place is very clear in my eye. And two things in that house, my childhood.
She's talking about her memories of her childhood.
Mornings. We had a big wooden stove in the studio, which had gone with to go to the chimney hole and would warm all the house. And my father, every morning, I had got up and would put a fire, and we children would come, especially the younger one, I remember always, get my clothes, come down to the warm place. And he used to do the bread. He used to toast on the stove. And my mother would put the butter on it. And then the smell, the toast, it is so in my eyes. I will never forget that. And one summer day, I remember, we had a balcony at the backyard. And we had our supper there. And that I remember. That too is so clear.
happy memories. Your memories are happy memories.
Yes.
Okay. This happens to be a photo of her taken in 1915, running down the stairs, or not running, I guess. She had to stop for her father to take a photograph of her with her clothes, because she smelled the toast. But all of these elements, I mean, obviously, we're trying to create a kind of atmosphere that people can understand the kind of loss that took place. The other, and I'll go through the rest of it fairly quickly, we recreated the exhibition, but because of a different space in Merzifon. And this was, for me, personally the most rewarding part of my work, was taking these photos back to my family's hometown. In a sense, repopulating that town with these images. Merzifon is here in the north toward the Black Sea. Okay, you know that part of Turkey. We had to completely recreate it because it was in a tashan. This is sort of a place where merchants and caravans would come through. So this is a historic building, which was full of Armenian graffiti. But we had to do things on panels because of the nature of the building. We couldn't attach things directly. So we created these panels. We were able to get the local business chamber of commerce to give some money to copyright this. They saw this as sort of good for commerce and tourism. Of course, we did some self-censorship. Istanbul, we used the Turkish word for genocide, soykırım, Ermeni soykırım, the Armenian genocide, and we decided with consultations with our local hosts who were themselves willing to use the word, but they didn't want to cause extra agitation. They accept it as genocide, but not certainly the majority of the community doesn't, so we left the word out in the text. Except last minute, night before the exhibition opened, we discovered that we forgot to take it out in one place. And as you can see, it was in this remark about April 24th is indelibly in the memory of the Armenians as the Meds Yargurn. That's a great crime. That's the word that Obama uses now to describe the genocide, becoming the date on which they will commemorate the Armenian genocide for generations to come. And as you can see here, Ermeni soykırım's there, so we had a debate about what to do. We took a piece of black tape. Fortunately, the panels about 1915 were black with white lettering, so we easily took a piece of black tape and covered over the word Ermeni soykırım, which actually created more attention. People looked at it and they knew what the words were that were missing at that point. And these are some of the students that I met in their English class earlier in the year. They came, their principal brought them here. The school they were in was a former hospital that was part of the Anatolia College. My grandfather worked in the hospital as the X-ray technician, because in that day, X-rays were done, photography and X-rays were the same line of business. And then we took it to Diyarbakir, to the Sırp Giragos Armenian Church in 2014. This is a recently restored Armenian church, the largest church in the Middle East. It's unfortunately in a no-go zone at the moment because of the fighting in the southeast. And we did the display in panels around the porticos of the church and also in some of the side rooms. Again, in Diyarbakir, because it's a Kurdish area, and the Kurds have become many Kurds have become open to what happened and their role in the Armenian genocide. And because they became the next victims, in a way, after the Armenian genocide. So there was quite a welcome for this exhibition. And we used the same panels as we did in Merzifon. And I know my assistant, when he was hanging that panel with the black tape, he said, "Oh, I got to remove the tape." But before he could even get to it, somebody passed by and took the tape off. This November, under more difficult circumstances, I took the exhibition to the capital of Turkey. It took more effort to get this organized. But the breakthrough here was that it was organized at the Connecticut Municipal Contemporary Arts Center, which is a public building. Up until this point, it was in private buildings. So here is a government building that's under the mayor's office. The mayor is CHP, which is the Chemist Party, but they've now become a bit more open to this question of the Armenian issue. And we had, of course, again, a local sponsor here, this organization of aesthetics and visual culture and Anadolu culture. And here, again, this is just a poster of it. It's a beautiful space. This is the gallery with the exhibition, and as you see, images of people. People love to take photographs of the photographs. There's nothing you can do about that. And again, we're using the black panels here. And here we had a lot of pushback in the press, we had a lot of positive comments, but there were a number of newspaper articles written. This one says, CHP municipality exhibition scandal. Okay. They were very upset. This piece was written in a nationalist paper. Translated CHP November 10th event, Armenian exhibition. The mayor's office was forced to respond with a press release saying that they didn't endorse the content of the exhibition, and they put on other exhibitions with different views, but they're not in the business of endorsing or not endorsing. In a sense, this was a sort of veiled sort of defense of freedom of expression, which is rare these days in Turkey. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Second part of the project are the books and publications. This is the book that is based on all the family memoirs. Of course, it came out in English last year, but it's now been translated in Turkish, and it should appear within the month in Turkey. And here, there is absolutely no censorship about the events. But again, it's not just about 1915. This book came out 2 weeks ago in Istanbul. I was there for the book launch and another exhibition, except ISIS decided also to set off the bomb in Istanbul the same day as my exhibition. In Ankara, they did it 3 weeks before my exhibition, but this time they got the timing, unfortunately, a little better. And this is in Turkish and in English, and it has 285 photographs with captions and a condensed version of the story. And this is just an example of what's in the book. These are, when my mother hesitated about nearly everyone else was lost, these are her two nieces, the only two members of the family that survived outside of their hometown, and they were adopted into the family. And quickly, sites of remembrance. Merzifon, I've gone back many times, and I'm working with local people so that the Armenian sites and their importance get properly identified. Now this is as I said, the family home, glass roof and wall for the photography studio. This is what it looks like today. You can see the indentation in the roof where the glass used to be. The family that lives in the house moved in a year after our family moved out. They were part of the population exchange between the Greeks and the Turks. So they lost their home in Saloniki, outside of Thessaloniki. They're living in the house. They're very welcoming. My visits, my relatives visiting. I've given them photographs, and we hope that someday to put a marker on the house. See, this is the same. This picture from 100 years ago. This is the hospital where my grandfather worked. That's now the high school that I visited a number of times. This is me with the director of the high school. You might see the family home there. And then we had discussions about putting the photographs of what it used to be like in the school, so there are photographs with captions in the hallways of what this was before. This is just the neighborhood of the Armenian homes. A few of them exist today. We're trying to identify them. This is one of the famous Armenian professors who was killed in the genocide. His house still exists, and we want it properly identified. The new owner said that he's going to do that. This is another professor's house that is owned by the city. This is the professor. This was the last, this is the Armenian church, the Protestant church, where my grandfather was the deacon and head of the Protestant community. It's been converted into a cultural center, an art center, auditorium. This is the Catholic church, Armenian Catholic church, which today is a wedding parlor, wedding catering facility. We're going to have that also identified, and I've met with the mayor a couple of times, who seems to be open to these things. Again, there are self-interests here, commercial interests, trying to bring people to the town. And my local people that I work with, who are very supportive of my work, are contemplating buying this house. It's an old Armenian home. A couple of others are possible, to have as a site of memory where many of the photographs and artifacts will eventually be displayed. I've already talked for a long time, just quickly through these photographs. This is actually, it's a barn, but in one of my trips I discovered it's more than a barn. It used to be the monastery of the community and played an important role in my family's story and in the story of the deportations. As you can see, these are the 12 apostles. And we're going to try to also have this identified and at least preserved, but currently it's a barn. And I won't say anything more about Chunkush. Is another town in another part of my family story that's in the southeast. It's a place you can't go to today because of the violence. I went to it in June, and then within a month or so. And there are many remnants of the Armenian community there, including this monastery. And this man is saving, trying to protect these artifacts. He's Kurdish. But as you can see, there's quite a bit that's left. And this is his mother, who is actually half Armenian, who was a survivor of the almost complete annihilation of the Armenian community in Chunkush. She was saved at the last minute. She was going to be thrown into this deep pit, and some Turkish officer thought she was attractive, not her mother, thought she was attractive and grabbed her. Forced marriage. This is her daughter. So, this is the end. Thank you for your patience, and I welcome as many questions as you like.